Hello, it's Pastor Russell here again, and it's good to have you all with us here for our Sunday service. We're looking at Acts chapter 27 and a little bit of chapter 28. So if you haven't read that rather long reading, I'd encourage you to stop this now and have a bit of a read. It's a really great passage, and we want to speak to you from that. Okay, so hopefully you've all read it. I want you to have a look at why Luke writes in so much detail about this journey. Commentators and theologians have wondered that in this whole story where he's trying to present the gospel. Why does he go into such amazing detail? Becomes a wonderful study of the work of sailors and so on. Why does he do that? What's his point? And as I've looked at that, I'm quite sure that what Luke is doing is that he's giving us a really great insight into actually how Paul and himself and these apostles lived, some of the struggles which they had to go through on this trip from Caesarea to Rome. And he's doing that as an example of how God works in our lives in providence, in the way he works in the circumstances of life and how his providence works, so that in all things he works for good. But what sort of things happen, and how does he actually work, and what are the things that we need to understand? I'm sort of imagining that life is a bit like a jigsaw puzzle. And I've got here a little jigsaw puzzle with 7 little pieces. And it's like what Paul does here Luke does is he gets some of these key ideas from this story to illustrate or give us a picture of how God works on our journey of faith as we seek to work for Christ. Now, so what we see is Paul's life was, in his conversion, God took him from the chief of sinners to the greatest apostle. And he was an example of what God can do in our life. And in this journey here from Caesarea on this boat through to Rome, Paul's journey becomes a picture of our journey in life and the things that we've got to face. So I want you to have a look at just 7 little pictures of this journey along this thing for us to think about and meditate on. Now, the first picture I've got is as Paul set out from Caesarea and he drops in at Sidon, and then here he is setting off to a place called Myra, and here he is standing on the ship, looking out and thinking, hey, I'm on my way and God's with me. And so we see as we read the book of Romans and as we read the book of Acts that Paul has actually already written to the church in Rome saying, I've got a plan and God's on board with me and he's revealed this plan to me, and we're going to come and we're going to share the gospel to you in Rome, and you're going to help me to go on to Spain. And so Paul has had these plans and God's been guiding him, and he's prayed and he's planned and he's prepared, and finally through an amazing circumstance he's been arrested. The plan's taken a lot longer than he thought. He's been arrested, but now he's got free passage to Rome. He's on a ship and things are looking pretty good. And so the first point about I think from this is just like the first picture on a little bit of a jigsaw puzzle of our life is that part of the key of walking with God is we've got to formulate, well, what's God's plan for me, and try and make my plan and God's plan overlap. And we see that that's what Paul does. He finds God's plan and purpose for his life, and he sets out. And as he sets out, he's excited, he's pleased. He has to take a little bit of a detour. Instead of going to the south of the island of Cyprus, he goes north because the wind was sort of in the wrong way. But hey, things are going great, and he's off and he's excited. And so that's the first thing, is we've got to come to some idea of what God's plan is for our life, and bring his plan and our plan together and set out on the journey. Now, The second picture I want us to look at is how God deals with us in providence in our life, is picturing of Paul having been blown off course instead of going straight off to Rome and taking the long way. Suddenly a wind has, instead of going west, they've been blown south and they've had to retreat into the southwest corner of the island of Crete, and they're having to sort of seek refuge in this place called Fair Havens. And it's a nice little place, but it's not a great place. But now this journey from this second ship which they had to hop on in Myra through to this place in Fair Havens, it's taking them far too long. It's been long and arduous. They're now too late. Winter's upon them. And now their journey, which was supposed to be, they should have already been in Rome, and now here they are stuck in this place called Fair Haven with a very, very difficult thing. Well, how are we going to go? And so this second picture brings us this thing was, hey, here I am, the Apostle Paul. I've got this plan, and God's confirmed this plan. He wants me to go to Rome. I want to go to Rome. And here we are heading to Rome on a ship, and instead of going to Rome, we're blown off course, and here we are finding ourselves in this port we never intended to go, and now having been delayed. And I think that the picture of God's sovereignty in this that we've really got to get our head around if we're going to go through the journey of life properly is that even Paul was subject to the whims and waves and wind in this world. He was blown off course. He was planning this way and he was following this, but he is part of this fallen creation. He has to struggle in this fallen world. And if we can't get that concept that God, in God's providence, we live as Christians in a fallen world. We're subject to the weather patterns, the problems of the world that everyone else has to follow. We're not given this perfect plan which we follow along and everything just falls into place. It seems like we're getting blown off course and we're subject to the limitations of a fallen world in a fallen bodies. Our bodies grow old. This world we live in is not perfect and it seems to be against us. And another picture would be the similar one was how Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden. They're not living in paradise. They're living in a fallen world, and God upholds this fallen world in his providence, and we have to live out our life in this fallen world where often God is in one sense is against us. This fallen world fights against us, and so we see Paul being driven into this not so great a harbour called Fair Havens, and it seems like God hasn't really made his plans work out as he hoped. Now, the third picture we see is Paul on a doomed ship, having been on that ship for nearly 2 weeks. Everyone else on that ship, and possibly Paul himself, thinks that they are totally doomed and without hope. What's happened is at Fair Havens, Paul he's already been shipwrecked a couple of times before. He spent a lot of time sailing around in his missionary journeys, and he has a look at the situations at Fair Havens. He knows this place they're at is not a good place to winter, but he knows that it is far more dangerous to keep going and try to find a better port. He knows they can't get to Rome. Everyone on the ship knows they can't get to Rome. They're going to have to winter somewhere. And so they have this debate. Paul says, no, we'll stay here at Fair Havens. It's not the best, but it'll do. And everyone else votes against him and says, we're going to go. And so they head off to a place called Phoenix, about 60 or 80 kilometres down west. And instead of getting there, it starts off, it seems like, you think, what's God doing? It starts off, they get this beautiful wind, a southerly wind, which is exactly what the ship needed to have a safe trip to Phoenix. So they said, yes, we wanted to go there. The wind's for us, circumstances say, and so they head out. But short time later, the wind picks up and they get this howling, ferocious storm drives them, and the ship starts to fall apart. They have to chuck out these sea anchors to try and stop themselves from being blown, because they can see they're actually getting blown to Africa, where there's all this low sand banks, and they're sure they're going to be blown into that, and they're being in their storm for so long, they're sure they're doomed. And here's Paul sitting in this boat going, what's God doing? And why am I here when it wasn't my decision? And so that's, I think, the next picture is, often in life it seems that even if we know the right way to go, we're prisoners of others' bad decisions. We have to deal with other people's messes and problems, and we often, even when we know the right way to go, we can often end up having to carry the burdens of other people and their wrong decisions. Not to say, that's not counting even when we make wrong decisions and we end up in the wrong place where God hasn't wanted us. We often find, even with the best intentions, it seems like God has led us astray. Things have gone wrong. Now, I know I've been in that. I've shared many times how when I was a missionary in Vanuatu, I ended up in a place where my health was broken. I felt my whole life had fallen apart, and I had this overwhelming sense of loss and grief, where I said, I've burnt all my bridges behind me, and now I've come to an end, to a burnt out bridge. There's no place forward and there's no place back. And here's Paul in the middle of the night. He's hungry, he hasn't eaten for nearly 2 weeks. He's afraid, he's confused. He's on a boat where everybody thinks it's going to sink. Now, that leads me to the fourth picture which I want to bring to us, and that is, as Paul is in this situation where he's felt that God has sent signals to get them to make this journey he recommended them not to take, and now him and all these 276 people on the ship are doomed to death, it seems, in the Mediterranean Sea. We're told that Paul suddenly gets a visitation from an angel, and I'm sure what's happened here, Luke doesn't mention it, but I'm sure what's happening is Paul has been praying, and he's praying and praying and praying. He's wrestling with his emotions as he's hungry and afraid and scared. It would be just horrible being in that boat, being tossed and turned, and here he is in the middle of the night. It's dark, they haven't seen the sun or the moon, they don't know where they are, and Paul prays, and while he's praying in the middle of the night, maybe in a dream, maybe he's awake. My guess is that he's actually awake, but he can't actually sleep. He has a vision of an angel, and God comes in this, when it seems that all is lost, when all has gone out of his way, he's totally helpless in this time where it seems even this Paul, with his great faith, is being tested beyond what he is able to stand and beyond his breaking point. God comes and sends an angel and gives him hope and encouragement. And so this third thing is God, in the journey of life, he takes us to these extreme points where we come to have to call upon God's grace. And it's really important in this whole idea of God's providence is that God works through the circumstances of life, but we have to, in prayer, call upon God to access his grace. And that's what prayer is we're seeking to access God's grace, to bring extra grace to bear, to grab hold of God's supernatural workings and provisions beyond that which is normal. And that's something which prayer and the ability to pray and to access God's throne gives to us. We have the ability to access extra help from God in our times of need. And so we see here in this time of deepest despair, hungry, afraid, at the end of the limits of his faith, God answers Paul's prayer and comes to his aid. And there's a wonderful promise in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 that God will not allow us to be tempted beyond what we can endure. But he takes us and he guides us, he leads us into prayer to call out, and he gives grace to help in those times of need. Now, the fifth picture I want us to give and see in this is everyone on the shore. It's the middle of the night. It's not the middle of the night. It's wet, it's cold, but we see Paul having prayed with the people, being encouraged. Eventually, everyone is wet and cold, but they're all safe on the shore of this island called Malta. They're there. It looked like everyone was going to die, but here they were, according to God's promise, here stuck on this. They actually don't even know where they are, but they have got there, and what looked like a disaster, God's grace has caused them to be there on that island, and everyone has got from various means. Some of them have swum, some of them have floated in on broken up bits of the ship. And it's just an amazing picture of how they all would have felt as they're standing on the island. And just a few things which led to that was, even though God in answer to Paul's prayer had sent this angel, the angel said, "You're all going to be saved." Even in the unfolding of that story, we see that the sailors tried to abandon ship, go off with the lifeboat and leave the rest of them to drown and just save themselves. And Paul had to work, even despite the promise, to make sure that the sailors all stayed on board. And so the centurion cut that boat off. And so even though God, in a sense, has his plan, we have to work and strive to see that. But despite all these ups and what we could say is these contingencies and having to make the right decision, eventually God's plan is fulfilled. And there they are, safe and secure on Malta. Now that's, in a sense, good news, but it's also bad news. I don't know where they are. Here is Paul's trying to get to Rome, and here he finds himself cold, freezing and miserable, but at least safe. Now sometimes we can be like that in life. Life can end up and we can be in a place, well, I'm safe, but this is not actually where I want to be. And maybe that's where you are now. But maybe you feel that you're in a place where, hey, God, this isn't the place where I envisaged I would be. But God hasn't finished yet. You're still on the journey. And so that's the fifth picture. Now, the sixth picture I want to give to you is this, and that is Paul laying hands on these people on the island of Malta, praying for them and seeing amazing healings. And the story which leads to this picture is that there they are on the land, and the people of the island come out, they see that this ship is wrecked, and we're told that they show them unusual kindness. Having gone to the pits of where they're being shipwrecked and having to throw themselves into the ocean, now they find themselves on this island, and all these people come out, and they're nice and they light a fire. And I think it's just amazing, and this I sort of think of some occasions in my life where it seems everything's gone wrong. What more could go wrong? And here Paul he's going here, says, well, we're on this island, we don't know where they are, they're sort of trying to find out, it's really cold, they light this fire to warm themselves, and here Paul goes, well, I'll help, I'll do the good thing, I'm not going to cry, I'm not going to have a hissy fit, I'll help. And he grabs some brushwood and he's carrying the brushwood there to the fire, and a snake comes out and latches onto his hand and bites him. And I just find it just an amazing story there. And the islanders think, well, he must be a murderer. God was trying to kill him, but he spared all the others, but he's still going to make sure he kills Paul because he's obviously a bad dude. But Paul shakes this snake off into the fire and it falls in. And as a result, people start thinking he's a god. And as a result, this whole crowd of people and the whole people in Malta are opened up to listen to Paul as he preaches the gospel. And they realise, hey, this guy can do something for us. And so Paul's able to share the gospel with them. He sees the opportunity to pray for this man Publius. And so this same hands which had been on this shipwreck and had swum or clung to a bit of driftwood to go onto Malta. Now Paul is there praying for Publius' father and he's healed. And then he lays his hand on many of these people in Malta and they're healed. And God is actually using what looked like an amazing devastation to start a church on the island of Malta. And it's just an amazing thing. It wasn't on the plan. But this waylay, this seeming disaster where they've been blown off course, God is using that. And God has, in his providence, although he has this plan to take Paul from Jerusalem via Caesarea through to Rome, he also has other plans and other people. And so Paul is on Malta, not so much for his sake, but for these people's sake, so that he can share the gospel with them. And often that's how it is with life, is the things which are happening to us they're in a sense for us, but God wants to touch other people's lives. He wants us to impact, and the things that we've been through, he wants them to be able to be used to impact the lives of others. And so we see how God's providence works. It's not just all about us, it's for other people as well. And God's plan is ultimately, he's not focused on the little things, he's always gospel focused. To enable people to know Christ as their Saviour and to grow in knowledge of Jesus. Now, the final picture, and I didn't get you to read that in the text, but it's what happened after they've been in Malta for 3 months over the winter. Paul's obviously would have started a church there. There would be a flourishing group of Christians, and they head off, and the amazing picture at the end is it's like they have everything going right. There's a ship in Malta which had been wintering. They head off for Rome. They actually weren't too far from where they should have been. They head off on this Alexandrian ship and they get the perfect wind. They find themselves arriving in Rome, and the picture I'm left with is Paul sitting down with these Christians he had wrote to many years ago, saying, I'm going to come to Rome and I'm going to encourage you and you can encourage me, and we'll send you off and you can help send me off so I can take the gospel to Spain. And so here Paul is with the church of Rome, praising God, sharing the wonderful stories of his providence and encouraging one another and giving praise to God for his amazing grace and power. And so that's the final picture. And so we see here these 7 pictures, 7 like scenes from this whole journey. And each one is very, very different, but together God uses all of these different parts to to make a great picture. And it's not just our own life where God is seeking to have a plan for us which he's working at. He's working that plan into a bigger plan into which even the picture of our own life fit. And so that's what we see, I think, in this story of Paul's trip to Rome, a picture of how God's providence works in our lives, in all of the ups and downs, the twists and turnings, the seeming mistakes, the oh no, not another disaster moments, but in amongst all of these things, that God is working for our good. He has a plan and a purpose for our life and for the lives of those we come in contact with. And I trust that this can be encouraging to you to put in perspective where God has you at this moment in your life. So God bless you all, and I trust you will be encouraged to be strong in your faith no matter what your circumstances are.